So I'm writing a novel. Is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also answer listener questions and, sometimes, interview people who write fiction. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. As part of my research in trying to become more familiar with the sword and sorcery genre, I discovered what is referred to as sword and soul. Sword and soul means sword and sorcery stories focusing on tales of people of color with semi-historical or full-on fictional settings rooted in African history, cultures, and myths. I think it's fair to say it was born out of the work Imaro by Charles Saunders. And in studying Saunders and learning more about him, my attention was drawn to a contemporary writer named Milton Davis, with whom I'll be speaking today. Milton is a speculative fiction writer, but also a publisher, as owner of MV Media, a small publishing company specializing in science fiction, fantasy, and sword and soul. Their mission is to provide speculative fiction books that represent people of color in a positive manner. As an author, he has written 21 novels and short story collections, his most recent being a sword and soul adventure called Ida Blessed 2. He's also a contributing author to Black Panther Tales of Wakanda, published by Marvel and Titan Books, and co-author of Hadithi and the State of Black Speculative Fiction with Eugen Bacon. There is a great deal more he's done as editor as well, but I think the best thing to do is just get into it and let Milton tell you about himself. Oh, and heads up, there was a weird humming noise at two close together points that I don't know where it came from and didn't know how to remove, but you know what? Still a really fun interview, so yeah, heads up and enjoy. And here we are with Milton Davis. Hi, Milton.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Pretty good. All right, especially now I got rid of the cat that just made that noise. So anyway, it's very professional over here. Let's get into it. Okay, so going as far back as you can remember, what is your, sort of the earliest reading experience you had that led to your lifetime love of fantasy fiction?
Well, it's interesting because initially I did not read a lot of fantasy and fiction. I used to be a big history reader. And any experience I had with fantasy came through with my cousin. My cousin was a big comic book reader. And I guess my first introduction to fantasy was the Conan series that Marvel did. And that was my first time seeing, getting into fantasy and the whole Conan thing. I really loved the way they did it. And that kind of got my interest in it. But it wasn't until I was in college that I actually started reading science fiction and fantasy. And that was because I had a college instructor. I was a chemistry major and I had an English class and I did my first essay, and my instructor, Anna Holloway, who's a friend of mine now, called me to her office and said, well, why are you majoring in chemistry? You're a good writer. And I said, well, writers don't make any money. And and I've proven that over the years. But but anyway, she was the person who actually introduced me to science fiction and fantasy. I think it was since I was a science major. I think that was her way to get me interested in writing by introducing me to something that she felt like was connected to what I was majoring in. And so it was initially people like Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein and Samuel Delany, but eventually it started going into some of the fantasy authors like Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock, different things like that. So that's what really kind of got me into it.
Cool. And I'm going to be that guy. I'm curious, do you remember with the Marvel Conans, was that the sort of mainstream Marvel line, or was it those Savage Sword of Conan magazine-sized guys that were always in black and white?
It was those, the Savage Sword of Conan. It was those and the comic book as well. I read both of them.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, they both, and of course it was movies. I grew up in the 60s, so I'm watching, everything like that to me was mainly visual. So I was really into like Jason and the Argonauts and stuff like that. So my I guess I would consider that too kind of my introduction to fantasy as well, but it was mostly visual. It wasn't really the written word.
Okay, so I kind of gave my own take on it before we got into the interview portion here, but I would love to hear your definition for the listeners of sword and soul. How would you define that?
Well, to me, sword and soul is basically fantasy, epic fantasy, sword and sorcery that's based on pre-colonial African culture and tradition and history. That's basically what it is in a nutshell.
Cool. And now you publish other things, but I feel like that's sort of your flagship genre with MV Media. Mm-hmm. What's it like being both a writer and a publisher? Like when you submit your stories to people, does your publishing side make you kind of want to dispute any rejections you get a little more? or kind of like being both the referee and the player, or how's that go?
I think it makes me more sympathetic to people who submit stuff to me, because as a writer as well, I understand what they're going through, and I think it makes me kind of a softie because I've been on the other end of it. But once I started self-publishing, once I started indie publishing, I really don't submit. I very rarely do I submit something to magazines or other publications. It's usually by request. Somebody will get in contact with me and say, "Hey, Milton, I got this anthology coming up, and I wanted to know that it'll be either can you write a story for it, or I read this story that you wrote, and I want to know if I can use this in our anthology." And I guess for me, the pressure's not there as far as submitting, because I am an indie publisher. I know my stuff is going to get published one way or another.
True. And my apologies. I forgot, of course, there are people approaching you. You don't have to audition anymore. We're at that level of the career. My apologies.
No
speaking of publishing, I mean, you've been doing it for a while, right? Like 16 years, if I'm correct?
Well, actually 13 years. I started writing in 2005.
Oh, pardon me. Sorry, I got mixed up.
That's when I decided that I was going to do this thing, and I was going to do it indie. And it took me about 3 years to write enough, to have enough content to where I started publishing. Because I wanted to make sure that that I wanted to let out at least one book every year. So I wanted to build enough backlog to where I wouldn't be writing on the next book for that next year. I'd always have to be 2 or 3 books ahead. So when that year came around, I can just say, okay, we'll roll this book out. I'm working on book 4 while book 1 is being released, that kind of thing. So that was my plan going into it.
All right. Well, that's work ethic, man. I'd love to get out 1 book a year. Jeez. And I'm wondering, if you could travel back in time and talk to your 2008 self, I suppose, pardon me, what would you tell them that you've learned in publishing, to save them some grief? What lessons did you pass back to yourself?
I would tell them that your business projections are wrong. That's not what I tell them. But there's really not much I would change. I was very fortunate that when I got into, I decided to do indie publishing after studying the market, and I really had a feeling that what I was trying to write was not going to be very acceptable to publishing at the way it was at the time. And that's one of the reasons I decided to go independent. I also wanted to I had my own business back in the day. I wanted to do that. I just wanted to have the freedom to write stories the way that I wanted to write them without any kind of input. And all of that just came down to being an indie publisher. I was fortunate when I decided to do it that I ran into people who were experienced at doing that, and they gave me very good advice on how to get started. And so it helped me avoid some of the pitfalls that people run into when they're doing indie publishing, like bad editors and, people that tell you they're going to do this and never do it, that kind of thing. They gave me contacts that helped me get into the whole process very easily. So I really don't have too many regrets about it. I think based on what I was available to do at the time, and I just started where I could and just worked my way to this point.
Okay. Is there any one piece of advice or lesson you'd want to pay forward to anybody looking to start their own company now?
I would just say do the research and understand that when you become a self-publisher, indie publisher, you are basically going into business, because you have to do everything yourself and you're responsible for everything. And you have to go at it with that kind of a work ethic. It's, nobody's really going to do anything for you. You have to be able to, your marketing, your cover design, everything. You got your editing, you have to pay editors, all that stuff you have to do yourself. And I do a class once a year. Well, I was doing it once a year till recently, where I would talk to people about self-publishing. And the first question I would ask them was, what do you want to get out of writing? And that will determine whether or not self-publishing is for you, or if you should take another path. Because some people just they want to write. They don't want to be bothered with all the other stuff. And if that's what you want to do, then I would tell them you need to really reconsider becoming an indie publisher, because you have to set aside time to do all that other stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just saying in my last interview to author Jess Frey there, we were talking about self-publishing and how you need to be prepared in the sense that, you can do everything. You've got total creative control, but you just want to change that tone of voice slightly and be like, you can do everything. You do everything.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. It's a good thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, part of your kind of literary origin story was meeting and then going on to have had a working relationship with the father of Sword and Soul, Charles Saunders.
Yeah.
Author of the magnificent Imaro series and more. And I imagine, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think so, you would agree with me that Saunders isn't just noteworthy. He is noteworthy, but he's not just noteworthy for being a Black sword and sorcery author writing stories grounded in African culture. He's noteworthy because he was a good writer that brought new depth to his beloved genre. So what is something you admire about his writing, about his craft?
Well, that's you said it exactly. The thing about it, I never read Charles until right before I was about to release. Well, I actually did. I read the first story by him was called the first story I read by him was a story called Gimli's Song, which is in the Dark Matter anthology, which was the first anthology that was created with focusing on Black speculative fiction. And it was a story about one of his other characters that people don't really know a lot about. Is her name is DeSoye. And I read this story and I was like, man, this is a good story. This guy Charles is pretty good. But I wasn't really into fantasy and science fiction at the time when I read it. But then as I was working on my own projects, I was like, somebody has had to do this before because it's just too much stuff out there. And right before I was released, I was working on Meiji. I can't remember the name of the publisher now. Nightshade. They had re-released the Imaro series, and I was like, okay, I knew there was somebody else out there, and that's when I started reading this stuff. And when I started reading this book, it's just his storytelling ability, and for me, particularly as a writer, his vocabulary was just blowing me away. And I'm like, this guy must have his own little thesaurus somewhere, that is just for him. And he has all these words, and I was just reading this stuff, and it's just the depth of the story was a lot different than what I was used to when I read your typical sword and sorcery type books. And as I read further on, after we met, and I started reading more and more of his series, started to go into the other books, you could see, even from the point that I ran it earlier, you could see his craft even getting better and growing to the point by the time you get to Imaro 4. After I read Imaro 4, I told people, I said, look, you need to stop comparing Charles Saunders to Robert E. Howard because in my opinion, he's way beyond that. And he's at this style where he's basically kind of gotten away from reflecting that traditional sword and sorcery where he's really into his own. He's really into his own at this point. And most people that I've met in sword and sorcery, they have a lot of respect for Charles. One of the reasons that I had an easier intro into the genre was because of people who were aware of him and what he had done. And the fact that he was saying, hey, check this young brother out, it was like, kind of giving me some leeway as I got into the genre with my stories.
Yeah, and like I wish he had even more recognition, and then it does seem to be happening that with the kind of sword and sorcery, dare I tempt fate and say Renaissance we're sort of having, or at least there seems to be more air going back into the balloon, like since the 80s, bad schlocky movies kind of let it out, that he's getting more attention as people are, working their way back through the stuff and then finding out. Like I've just started Imaro 2. And yeah, I can already tell, like even by the end, near the end of Imaro, for the first one, like you can see, as you say, like him evolving to more his own thing. Obviously he's influenced by Howard. That's where he started. But boy, does he just take it beyond. And even in the first book, like I love how he gives the character Imaro like just a lot more depth. Imaro's sort of constant search for trying to find a home and acceptance. Yeah. And how and at least as far as I've read, it never seems to work out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing about Imaro that captures you, because I've read all the Conan stories, and Conan's more this barbarian that's kind of just going from adventure to adventure. Basically, I mean, the running theme throughout most of the Conan stories is Robert E. Howard showing that sometimes the people that you consider uncivilized are more civilized than the people that are looking down upon them, and that kind of thing, But with Imaro, it's more of a personal story, and I think that's what makes it. That's what gives it its depth and gives it, and it resonates so much with other people's, because you're actually into, With Conan, I was more looking at, okay, what's this next adventure going to be? Who is it going to be fighting next? That kind of stuff. But with Imaro, I was really into him, not so much of the action, but how is this going to change his life? How is this going to get him closer to what he was searching and seeking and stuff, And I think that's what gives it that, that's what sets it apart from most of the sword and sorcery that you read.
Absolutely. And I also admire how, again, I've only just started book 2, but in what I've read so far, it's like, you have people like Fritz Leiber or Moorcock who would stitch together short stories they had written with no intent to create a saga later in their careers. Mm-hmm. And the seams would kind of show. I mean, great writers, but still, or have people who picked up Howard's work, Carter and DeCamp there in the 60s with their controversial Lancers collection of Conan, where they wrote their own stuff to fill in the gaps and so on and so forth, But then you read Imaro and he's starting out already with a vision in place, it feels. And I feel, I think in the first book, at least, you could pick out many of the stories and enjoy them on their own, even though there is continuity, but they, of course, reward you for reading them in order. And so it just shows this level of skill that I don't know, you don't find it too often.
That's true. And you see it too in the collection that we have, Nyumbani Tales, which is a collection of his short stories that he wrote over the years and got published in different magazines. And none of those stories have Imaro as a main character, but they talk about the world of Nyumbani. But even the separate stories that he tells in those stories, you actually see an underlying theme in all those stories as well. And as I read each story, I was like, okay, there's a I guess a theme that comes up in most of Charles's stories, and once you read enough of his work, you start to see it there. And when you get to know him, I mean, fortunately, I did get a chance to know him. You kind of like most writers, you see where that theme came from. A lot of times, it's reflections of your own personal life that you do consciously or unconsciously when you write your stories.
So Charles's writing needs to be discussed more. I think we'll both agree on that. But you were lucky enough to be friends with the man. I'm curious, is there anything kind of fun you could tell us just about who he was as a guy? Like any stories to share?
Yeah, he was. I think we hit it off. I met him through a friend of mine who had decided to publish Charles's books after Nightshade started to drop the series. And actually, when I read the Nightshade's books, I was trying to get in contact with him. Me, with my naive self, thought I could just get in contact with a publisher and they would give me his information. But when my friend announced he was going to be picking up the book series, I said, hey, man, is there some kind of way you can introduce me to Charles? I really like to meet him. And he did. We met through email. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to meet with him face to face. I found out that Charles had a lot of relationships like that where he was communicating with people long distance and stuff. But he read my book, he liked it. And so we started talking. And I think part of it had to do with our journey had a lot in common. We both were inspired by Robert E. Howard's works. We both chose to use pre-colonial Africa as our foundation for our stories. We were both influenced by some of the same regions in Africa and the same history. Like his book, Desoye, was based on the Minnow, which people call the Black Amazons from Dahomey. And I had actually come up with an idea for my book, Woman of the Woods, which was based on the same region for the same reasons and stuff. We this is separately. We were both born. Our birthdays were like 3 days apart. 11 years apart, but 3 days apart in July. Yeah. We were both Pittsburgh Steelers fans. So we both went to historically Black colleges. So it's just like all this stuff was just, it
was meant to be.
Yeah, it was just like we just kept running. There were so many things we had in common, and I think that had a lot to do with the fact that we became friends like that. We had a lot of things in common outside of the genre itself. He was a big, we would talk about football games all the time. He was a big boxing. He was a big boxing fan. Oh. He actually used to write a lot of articles about particular boxing matches and stuff. And that's something a lot of people didn't know about him, but he was really big really into boxing and stuff like that. So he was, he was, had a great sense of humor. He had a way of deciding what or what not he wanted to talk about. If I sent him an email about a subject and it was something that he really didn't want to discuss, when he sent me an email back, he wouldn't even mention it at all. I would say, well, okay, well, Charles didn't want to talk about this. But yeah, it was a great relationship. Again, like I said, the only thing I regret was that I never got a chance to really meet him face to face. I had planned to travel to Halifax at some point, but before I was able to get a chance to do it, he passed away. So he was an interesting person. He was fun to chat with. So.
Did he ever talk to you about maybe writing some boxing fiction? I have this weird half memory that Howard maybe wrote, because I know Howard went way out of sword and sorcery as well, right? He did westerns and everything else, and I feel like he did boxing stories, or did one or two. I don't know. I feel like there's a connection there somewhere.
Well, actually, Charles had a pulp character that he created called Damballa, and the book was published a few years ago. I can't remember Ron Fortier's publishing company, Airship 21. Mm-hmm. And in that story, there's a boxer in there. It's funny because when he first released Imaro, they had an issue because the publisher tried to describe him as a Black Tarzan. Yeah. And that had the Edgar Wright Burroughs, I guess I can't remember the name, what you would call them, but they rose up and said, no, you can't do that. The state, they said, no, we don't do that kind of stuff, So when he wrote Damballa, he said, well, you know what? I'm actually going to write my version of a Black Tarzan.
Oh, okay.
and that's what Damballa is, really, And he actually wrote a short Damballa story. Then he wrote this novel, and in that novel, it's about basically the Germans having this. This is like before World War II, having this boxer that they had basically, given these special abilities to. And in this particular story, Damballa ends up working with and end up having to fight this boxer and stuff. So that's the only fiction story that I know of that he actually incorporated his love of boxing into his fiction.
That's so cool, though. And I love how he took like the bad marketing he was given and was like, all right, I'm going to do something with that.
Yeah, exactly. He said,
what a great attitude.
Gonna, he said, I'm going to do it. He says, so if somebody's claiming that I did it, I'm going to actually do it.
No, I can respect the hell out of that. I love it. So I would say it's fair to say you have some idea of what's going on in the world of Imaro. What can you tell us, if anything, about, because I've been hearing rumors and whispers, they said something about it on Rogues in the House podcast, is there an Imaro TV series in the works? Do you know anything about that?
There is, I guess I can say there's an effort to make it happen. There's another gentleman that Charles knew really well. His name is Tack Kearnsey. He met Tack. Actually, I think he met Tack before I met him. And Tack was his charge was to get Imaro picked up in Hollywood. And it was something that he'd been working on for a long time. A few years ago, a producer got in contact with me trying to find Charles and said he was interested in Imaro. And one thing led to another. I got in contact with Tack. And so at this point, and I don't think I'm spilling any beans right now because Tack has talked about this, there is something that's in the works. I can't say where it is right now at this point, but there is an effort being made to do that. So,
well, I hope it goes all the way to the green light and gets out there, because I think people will be ready for it. I mean,
I think it'll be great to see it. I mean, it's something that hasn't been done before. It's another reason why that I started doing what I want to do, because I would look at these movies, I would see people like Michael Clark Duncan and folks like that, and I was like, these guys really need to have their own movies and shows in this same type of genre and stuff. So a lot of times when I sat down and I was writing, I was thinking about these people and saying, hey man, it'd be great if they did this or they did that kind of stuff, So hopefully, there's been some things kind of were delayed because of his passing, but some things as far as the estate is concerned have been worked out. So hopefully we'll start seeing some things moving in that direction next year.
Well, that'd be awesome, because I mean, it almost feels cliche to say it at this point, but like Black Panther made like $1 billion, right? Amongst other things that have come out, like in the last few years. I mean, it's just obviously an appetite for stuff that is not showing, the more traditional faces we keep seeing in spec fic and fantasy.
Exactly.
So yeah, I would watch the hell out of that, man. Whether they base it on, whether it's new stories or based it right off the first book, or exactly. I'm here for it. So Marvel, if you're listening, or whoever's producing, get this thing going.
Yeah.
All right. One of the things I really liked about a lot of Sword and Soul stories, or the ones I've read, I want to pretend I've read everything, is the focus on a pre-colonial setting, or maybe I even just want to say they lack a European colonial aspect, because when applied to a different world than Earth, pre-colonial implies that colonial is like inevitable, and boy, would it be nice to remind ourselves it isn't. So I was very interested to see, like, just this morning as we're recording this, an article, I'll link to the show notes, listeners, so you can check it out, about your Changa's Safari series, which seems much closer to like historical fiction or alt history than maybe the Sword and Soul I've seen so far, because it includes colonial elements. It's sort of rooted in our history, if I understand correctly, and even has some things in it like the slave trade. When you were coming up with Changa in the first place, what led you down this storytelling path rather than, say, like a secondary world?
Well, Changa was my way to combine my two loves together, history and fantasy. And so every book has a purpose, I guess, when I first started writing. When I wrote Meji, I wanted to write an epic fantasy that kind of expressed the size and the variety of cultures on the African continent. When I wrote Changa Safari, I wanted to tell a good story at first, but I also wanted to show the connections that Africa had with the rest of the world that a lot of people weren't aware of, because the Swahili culture was basically a culture that they were a seafaring culture, a maritime culture, with trading with East Asia, all as far as China. And I wanted to be able to show that. And so that was part of the reason that I wrote Changa Safari. Again, it allowed me to play in history like I love, and to add that fantasy element in it too. Every place that Changa and his crew visits, I basically tried to reflect that region of the world the way it was in the 15th century, not the way that we understand it now. And so I had to do research into that, and found out some very interesting things as I was doing it, and understanding the myths and mythologies of those countries during that time period. So it all kind of added to me. I felt like added to the richness of the story. And the entire time I was keeping people of African descent in the forefront of the stories the way that it would have been. We talk about Marco Polo going to Asia and him writing about his stuff like that, but the Swahili people were doing this on a daily basis, and it was just part of life for them. And, when the Portuguese finally came around the Cape and got to East Africa, they saw this thriving mercantile culture going on. And it wasn't like, sometimes you grow up in America, you keep thinking, oh, these people weren't doing anything until Europeans arrived. But when, and when they showed up, they were like, okay, the Portuguese, cool. What you got? We've got ivory, we've got this, we've got that. What you got? What do you have to trade? That kind of stuff like that, So it was, and I wanted to show that. I wanted to show that and express that in the books. One of the most interesting things that happened after I released it was a gentleman from Australia got in contact with me after I released the first Changa Safari book. And he said, I read the book. He said, I had no idea about this history. And he went to research it. And he said, you opened me up to something that I didn't really realize what was going on during that time. And to me, I want the books to be entertaining, but I also like it when people read the books and learn something from it, learn something about the culture.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great explanation. And I love it, man. I love it. Like, because, there's like 5 directions I want to go in because I think it's so interesting. Sorry. But like, okay, first up, one thing that I was thinking of while you were saying that to me was I often think of how when Fritz Leiber was coming up with Lankmar and those guys, he was originally going to set it in, Antiquity era Alexandria. And then Lovecraft warned him and was like, no, the history nerds are going to come for you. Make up your own place. And so are you ready for the history nerds? Do you feel prepared for people being hang on, no, it was like this?
They've come for me. And it's the thing about it is that in the most part, it's been positive. People have read my stuff and they've actually said, hey, I can tell you did your research. And when they do have criticisms, it's like constructive criticism. Okay. Instead of them attacking what I said, they will say, well, actually, this was kind of like this. And the people that really give me this is interesting because I did a panel at DragonCon a couple of years ago. And we were talking about this. And I had a woman come up to me and she was like, I can tell you did your research. I'm an archaeologist. And she said, like you said, sometimes historians can be biased. She said, if you wanted to get the truth, read stuff by archaeologists. Because we don't care about all that kind of stuff. We base what we say based on what we find, that kind of thing, So it's been you're going to miss some stuff. You're not going to get everything. And if you're not going to do it because, you're afraid of getting something wrong, then you'll never do it. You're going to get stuff wrong. I learned more about Swahili culture after I started writing Changa than when I was writing it. I was saying to myself, man, I wish I had known this stuff when I first started writing the book, because I could have incorporated this and it would have made Changa's story even more interesting. A lot of the stuff I learned about Swahili culture that I didn't know before I started writing the book showed up in the prequel before the safari, because I went back and added that stuff in there and stuff, so you're always learning something. So you can't not do it because you don't know everything. But as you go along, because part of the reason that you learn things is because you are doing it, and people are bringing you this additional information because you've started this journey, and people are looking at what you're doing and they're saying, hey, I like this, and then they'll get in contact with you and say, hey, check this out or research this, that kind of thing.
Well, first of all, that archaeologist story, that must have been so gratifying. That must have been so gratifying. Yeah. And and as you say, you can always keep moving the story forward or backward to put in the stuff that you've learned while, working on it, right? Like there's have you not come out with a volume of essentially origin stories for the Changa characters?
Well, actually, Before the Safari does do that. That's one of the things I wanted to do in that book, was that I actually give an origin story for each of the people, each of Changa's crew members, major crew members. There's a story in there about Panya, about the Tuareg, about Prince Aki. There's about Michele. And it shows basically what all of them were doing before they met Changa, what set them on their journey to meet Changa. And I also have an origin story about Changa in there. The first story is Changa's origin story. And it's mixed in with some other adventures that Changa takes part in before the actual safari begins. That's why it's called Before the Safari, because it kind of, all these little stories kind of lead you up to the beginning of the safari. The last story is Prince Aki's story, which if you've read the first book, it actually goes right up to the point where just before Changa and the rest of his crew meet Prince Aki. So
now I'm guessing people probably want to start with the first book, not the origin. Not before though, right?
The gentleman that wrote the article, Fletcher Vandenberg, been a big fan of Changa's. He says the Before the Safari book benefits more from having read the other books before you read it, the first 3 books. I actually used it as a break before I wrote the final book in the series. I just went back and did Before the Safari so I could it gave me time to think about how I was going to end the series as I was writing that book. And it kind of gave me a little break from telling the story.
Well, I like that too, right? Because it's almost like going back and going, all right, before I get to this ending, let me really understand my characters. Like really,
exactly.
really. I mean, I'm not that you didn't before, but go even deeper kind of thing.
Exactly. And it was during that book that I was able to take a lot of the stuff that I had learned about the Swahili culture while I was writing the series and have it reflected in the last book, the final book of the Changa series when I finally wrote it.
Well, I'm curious. I feel like I'm having so much deja vu this morning. I don't know why. I feel like this came up with another author, but I want to hear your take, as we're on it. A lot of sword and sorcery characters, you don't get origin stories, or if you do, they come later, like when Liber Stitched Together is, he wrote an origin story long after we were introduced to Fafhrd and Grey Mouser. How do you feel about the necessity and the proper timing, if you are going to tell it, of an origin story for your characters?
I think it depends on the story, the way you tell it. I always knew what Changa's origin was, but I didn't really feel the need to tell it because I didn't feel like it was necessary to tell that origin. It was more of me doing it was more of a response to people who started reading the books and were enjoying the books, and they were asking those kind of questions. And when I decided to do Before the Safari, I said, well, you know what? I'm just going to start it off with Changa's origin, because I already knew the story. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell it and stuff. I have another character, Omari Ket, which is, he comes from my Kikanga RPG world. And I started his series with his origin. Okay. Because for him, who he is and what he ends up being has a lot to do with his origin and where he came from. So that's why I started that story there, because you needed to know what launched him into his life as a indentured mercenary. What were the circumstances that started that? And that story also gives you a feel for the kind of person he is. It sets up who Omari Ket is. So as you read the book, you know him as you go through the different adventures and that kind of thing.
Well, and I think you've illustrated what my feeling is about this, and I'd like to hear if you agree. It seems like with origin stories, it's got to be a conscious choice. It can't be just like, well, you got to start at the beginning. I think that's where we get a lot of the lackluster origin stories, or the ones where people go back and write them because they're like, well, I guess I gotta, I mean, I like Ilmet and Lankmar, the example I always go to, but the individual origin stories for Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, not great. And a lot of people will tell you that. And I think it's just this thing of he's, Liber maybe felt like, I got to go back and do this. I guess I'll do individual stories. I mean, who knows? I don't read his mind. But I feel like we've all seen that, the origin story that feels kind of like it's just there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna do it, you have some people that just do it because maybe some agent came to them and said you need to write an origin story, and to me, if it's not important, if it wasn't integral to the telling the story, then why do it? Yeah. I'll bring this up as an example, like when I watch movies and stuff, and they're written a certain way, and then somebody says, hey, we want to put a black character in or something like that, and it's kind of an afterthought, and when they put the character in there, it feels like it was an afterthought.
Yeah,
that somebody just tried to jam that into the story, but when it's there in the beginning, it ties into the whole narrative as you see the whole story going through. Whereas, like I said, when I went back to write Changa's origin story, it was not more of an add-on or any of the characters really, because I already knew their origin stories before I started writing Changa Safari. So I just wanted to start at a certain point in their life. I was just telling the stories that I already had figured out. And when you read the stories, you see how those stories connect to the personalities of the characters when you met them when the safari started.
Yeah, and there was reader demand. You'd already hooked people with the questions that came into their mind while they were reading these characters later in their lives, right? So
I think it's really about, it's like even when you look at Charles, I think it's about that background story being there in the beginning, instead of somebody sitting down saying, "Hey, I want to write something like Conan," and they start writing the stories. And then somebody, and they never really haven't thought about the origin of these guys. They just create the scenario and they start writing it, but there's no background that really explained where they came from. Okay.
Yeah, whereas like with Imaro, I mean, not only is it sort of noteworthy because you don't get to see a lot of sword and soul or sword and sorcery heroes who start as children, right? You get a little bit of him as a kid. And boy, is it integral. I won't spoil it, listener, but trust me, it's there for a good reason.
Exactly.
But then meanwhile, while you're talking there, you kept making me think of, have you ever seen a movie that's like, the title is such and such : Origins, and you're excited. I always see, whenever I'm seeing that, like Wolverine Origins or whatever, I'm just like, oh man, this is not gonna be good.
Yeah,
But
and it's usually somebody going back that the stories have been told, and they say, hey, you know what, we want to do, we want to tell how this stuff all started. And they weren't the people that basically created the story or had a feel for the story, so they really don't. They really weren't in the author's mind on what they were thinking about when they wrote it, and it shows when you get this origin story, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, and that's where he got his pants from. Okay, sure. Usually it's not even answering any big questions. You're like, all right, okay.
Yeah. I'm not going to say the series, but there was somebody that there was a prequel series done from a science fiction series that I really like. And one of the worst prequel books was almost like that. The book was written just to explain one aspect of the story. And it ended so abruptly. I'm like, so why even write this? It had nothing to do with everything else that was going on in the novel. It was almost like, I just want to explain this. I'm going to write these few chapters just to explain that. And then I'm just going to leave it alone.
Yeah, and maybe also make a few dollars off of a franchise somebody else built. But maybe that's cynical of me. I don't know. Anyway, I could rag on this all day. Let's. You mentioned it. I really want to get into it. MV Media isn't just doing books and comics. Got into the tabletop role-playing game thing with Kikanga. Could you tell the people a little bit about that and about your personal connection to the tabletop RPG hobby? Were you playing D&D in the basement when you were like 11, or is it like a new thing? How did this all come about for you?
Okay, true confession. Like a friend of mine says, confession is good for the soul, but bad for the reputation. I had never played an RPG game before we created Kikanga.
Oh dear.
I'm just going to go ahead and lay it out there. The reason it happened was because my creative partner, Balogun Oj Tade, has played RPG games for 40, 50 years. He's played them for a long time. And when he was playing the games, he started off with Dungeons and Dragons. And like most Black people playing games like that, he noticed this lack of representation. So he actually would create his own scenarios for his D&D friends, and he would incorporate African culture into it. Not too long after we met, he and I was having a discussion, and we started talking about that. And him and I are the kind of people, that's the reason we get along so well. When we see stuff like that, we say, okay, let's do it. Instead of just complaining about it, we say, okay, let's do it. So we were talking about this, and I guess it was serendipity or whatever. We were getting ready to do a presentation, and there were a number of people in the panel. And as we were talking about it, this one guy came over to us. He said, are you guys talking about RPGs? And we said, yeah. He said, well, my name is Ed Hall. And then Balogun's eyes got big. He said, you're the Ed Hall? And I'm sitting there dumbfounded like, what's this the Ed Hall guy? He said, this guy's like an editor for White Wolf. He's done this game. He's done that game. Kind of stuff like that, So all three of us started talking. And we talked about the idea we were thinking about. And he said, well, hey, when you guys get it together, let me know. And, I'll take a look at it and give you guys some pointers or something like that, So, and that's how that all came to be. And my involvement in Kikanga was more creating the backstories and developing the world. Whereas Balogun's main point is he's the game master. He's our griot. He was the one that created the playing system, the different levels, and all those kind of details. And then we rolled it out a few years ago. It was different than most RPG games because we based it on a card playing system as opposed to dice.
Oh.
And now we're actually working right now on a Kikanga 2.0, which is going to incorporate dice because, we got tired of people crying about it. There were some people who really jumped on the card thing, and other people were like, oh, I want my dice. So, 2.0, which is going to come out, and it's going to have a dice playing system incorporated into it and stuff. But that's where that all came about. Again, it was Sword and Soul. We developed the anthology because we wanted to give people ideas about how to create the adventures and by telling these different stories and stuff. So we were trying to give everybody ideas because we know a lot of people aren't familiar with African culture. And so, they're trying to figure out, how do I tell a story this way? And so we said, well, we're going to give you some examples. And then maybe from these examples, you can go on and develop your own adventures.
Well, and parallel to that, I saw your Sword and Soul world building video, which, I thought was pretty solid. I'm going to link to that in the show notes so people can check it out. How to get their minds going. So Yeah, it's kind of cool actually to see like another pre-colonial, game out there. Like, I don't know, have you heard of Coyote and Crow?
I have not heard of that.
Oh, okay. You might want to check it out just out of curiosity. It is a pre-colonial North American indigenous peoples RPG.
Oh yeah, I did hear about that. I did see that because I know as far as African based, there was a game back in the day called Nyambe or something like that was out, and it was funny because as we were doing ours, we found out that a lot of times things that we do end up influencing other people.
Now, for the listener, influencing was put in quotation marks, so that's interesting. I mean, stealing is flattery, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes we talk about it sometimes, but I give you we had a particular character in Kikanga called the Frog Hag, and there was a story behind her. And not too long after the game came out, a particular well-known RPG company came out with a character that the illustration of the character looked exactly like our Frog Hag.
And it was like the Toad Witch.
Something like that. But even worse than that, I recently saw some person, they came out, there was a smaller company. Not only did they copy the character Kadira from Kikanga, they actually used the same name. They called their character Kadira.
Oh boy, like make an effort. I mean, I know you're copying, but
yeah, so it's been an interesting journey. But like they say, imitation is a serious form of flattery. So I guess we should be flattered by this.
I guess. I mean, okay, well, definitely let's encourage people to get the original, flavor. Go to Kikanga. Or, speaking of being ready for the nerds to come for you, man, I hope, your RPG buddies have warned you. When you come out with a second edition, that's going to start the edition wars. You're going to have people being like, no, first edition's better. Cards, man. You got to do the cards,
It was interesting when we first rolled the game out because we did test playing and we picked different groups of people to test the game out to see what they think about it. And it was distinct differences. Some of the old D&D veterans started complaining right off the bat. So you guys don't have categories like wizard and warrior and stuff like that. You're not using the dice and blah blah blah. And we're like, okay, that's because this is not Dungeons and Dragons.
I don't like this. You made your own thing.
This is not D&D. But then we had people who had never played role playing games before that we introduced it to, and they liked it. They liked the card system and stuff. They had no prior experience. But then we had, I hate to say it was an age based thing. Then we had younger people who had played Dungeons and Dragons. Then came to Kikanga and they enjoyed it. They got right into the differences and stuff like that. So it's, I found out that the role-playing game community, the players are very loyal to whatever they've been playing it, because some of them have been playing it for decades, with the same people and the same character. And so we're never trying to convert people. We're not trying to get somebody to stop playing this and then play that. What we're trying to do is just create our own game and find people that are interested in it. And when people get very upset, I just tell them, well, basically, this is a game. We're not trying to convert you. We're not trying to beat Dungeons and Dragons. We're creating our own game. Either you're going to look at it and be interested in playing it and enjoy it, or you're not,
Yeah, and I always find it funny when people get like that. Like, what, you can't enjoy two games? You just eat one food?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I'll tell you one interesting note, though. I was very surprised by the interest we got in Brazil. We had a lot of people in Brazil that really loved Kikanga, so much so that we actually had one company that wanted to make a Brazilian version of the game. They wanted to bring it in and do it in Brazilian Portuguese. At the time, we were being very cautious about exposing the game because we were concerned about people, taking it and trying to do their own things and stuff like that. So at the time, we didn't do it. But it's something that we're revisiting now because we're seeing a lot of interest in other countries like that, and having a version of the game where the language has been translated to something that they would make it easier for people in those particular countries is something that we're starting to focus on and look at now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't count me as an expert, but I've been an avid hobbyist for decades. And yeah, like as far as I know, there is a very strong role-playing game scene down there. And Germany, too. I remember every game I got into, I was a big Shadowrun fan. And if you ever heard of that one, it's like Cyberpunk meets Magic. And I just remember being stunned that they had German translations of all their books. I was like, they do that over there? Like, I'm just dumb kid growing up. But, there's definitely markets outside of the ones you'd expect. And as far as the older players, I hear you. I know you're still it sounds like you did the smart thing any businessman does. You found the talent to bring in to do, to handle the stuff you're unfamiliar with, the game mechanics, that kind of thing. So I'm just curious though, have you come across or encountered the term grognard?
No, I haven't.
Talking about role-playing fans?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. Well, it's like an oldish term unto itself. I forget exactly when it was coined, but it basically it originally was the term for like the oldest soldiers in Napoleon's army, his oldest, most wizened units, who would always kind of bitch and complain about things because they're like, well, we've been around, we can, whatever, right? And that term ended up, because D&D came out of wargaming, that term kind of got grafted onto like the older, more curmudgeonly players who are like, the card system in the role-playing game, what the hell? So yeah, maybe next time someone gives you that grief, you can just be like, hey man, I don't listen to Grognards.
Well, that's a term I have to keep in mind. Yeah. I mean, like I said, Kikanga was the first role playing game that I ever played. As we played, I could see why people would be interested and why people play playing games, because you're basically, you're creating a story as you go.
Oh yeah, no, I love it. Love the clever storytelling, and you get these. I'm still having laughs about memories from games I played like 15 years ago with those same buddies. You remember it just as much as like a crazy party story or whatever.
Yeah, and there's a number of game masters that have become novel writers because they're basically storytellers.
Oh yeah, yeah. Back and forth, people move along that axis for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I can talk about that all day long. But let's move on. It's one of my favorite hobbies. I'm getting my group back together tomorrow for the first time since COVID. But anyway, not about me. Let's move on, Oliver. You can tell I'm an only child, right? So Sword and Soul isn't just writing and gaming, as we were just discussing. It's also some pretty cool artwork, and as we also talked about, you've been adapting Changa's Safari as comic books. And last September, in your interview with Indie Comics Dispatch, you said that you guys are going to, MV Media are going to be getting further into publishing comics, and you want to get into animation as well, and taking some steps there. I mean, that could be an hour unto itself, but maybe just briefly, like, who are some of your favorite artists that you've worked with? What style do you feel works best for the genre?
That's a tough question because I love all the artists that I work with. I choose them based on what I think they bring to the story. I grew up around my cousins. I had two cousins that were artists, and unfortunately, I didn't have the talent. They let me know that very early on. But
kids, eh?
But I've always been surrounded by it, and so when I started developing these stories and these characters and stuff, I used to be part of a group called it was called Black Superhero. And it was basically a forum of a bunch of Black comic book artists. And I got exposed to a lot of these guys' works, and a lot of them are people that I work with now because I became familiar with the artwork in this group. And when it was a very volatile type group, but I would always pull people aside and say, hey, I really like your artwork. Can you do this for me? Can you do that work for me? So I think I more could talk about it more along the lines of people that I've worked with the longest. And one particular artist would be Stanley Weaver Jr. I've been working with Stan probably almost as long as I've been publishing. And when we first started working together, Stan was more of a contemporary comic book, futuristic type artist. And he really didn't have a lot of background on the regions and the cultures that I was looking at. So I would send him, photographic references. And he was very good at looking at those references and coming up with something for me. And at this point now, it's real easy for me to work with because he knows me and I know him, and all I have to do is just say, hey, Stan, I'm working on this new Omari Kett novel. This is what I'm looking for. I may send him a couple of references, and then he comes back and bam, he hits it right about the park because he has a very dynamic style, and his artwork is very energetic, has a lot of motion in it. And sometimes that's what I'm looking for when I'm doing a particular story. Other artists that I've worked with, one artist that you have to talk about is Mishindo Kumba. Mishindo's phenomenal. If you've seen the more recent Imaro books, Mishindo is the person that's done the cover for those books.
Oh yeah, 3 and 4 in particular. I'm thinking of
that's his artwork. He did the cover for my for our Kikanga anthology, my Kikanga game. He's done that work. He's a person artist that's into the Afrocentric vibe, and so he's another one that's very easy to work with when it comes to that. We've done some work with Brian Syme. Brian does a lot of RPG illustrations, and actually when we started Kikanga, he got in contact with us and said, hey, I think this is a great idea. I'd love to do some artwork for you guys. So that's what we work with him. There's so many of them that and like I said, I love them all. I really can't say Kira the artist, a young lady that's out of Florida. I work with her. She actually did the cover for Priestess of Enku. And I've known her for a long time. I love her style of artwork. She did some artwork that I used for Before the Safari. Again, each of them bring their own flavor to it. That's why I don't use them on every project, but there's certain projects when I pull up, I say, hey, I know this is perfect for Kira, or this is a great one for Stan, or that kind of thing like that. So I probably answered your question without answering it.
No, that's all good, man. I just wanted your thoughts and feelings, and it's definitely got me to, I noticed there was a very comic book feel to a lot of the art that
and that's why,
has, right? So that's why,
a lot of my artists are comic book artists. You get that vibe from them, which is okay with me. I like that.
Yeah.
But you have somebody like, for instance, Edison Moody. He did the cover to The City. Edison is more what you would see your more traditional cover art type artist, and it reflects on that when you see the cover of that book. So it's a lot of different artists.
I think we almost kind of illustrated it with this question, but I often wrap up interviews with things along the lines of like, who'd you recommend or whatever. But then there's always this fear in the guest where they're like, oh, I don't want to forget, Bob. I love Bob. I don't want to, or whoever. There's always kind of anxiety. I see this flop sweat, so I'm trying to get better. Let's see if I've gotten better. What I would instead like to ask, which is maybe a bit more of an appropriate question for you in your publishing role, who is the latest author you've taken on board? How did that go? What made you decide that they were worth, investing in?
Oh, okay. Well, there's 3 authors that I've currently published, each of them for different reasons. When it comes to Sword and Soul, there's an author called, her name is Sarah Macklin. And Sarah, the first thing I published by Sarah was her story in our Griot Sisters of the Spear. Matter of fact, her story is the opening story for the book, because I was so impressed by it when I read it. I was like, man, this is a great story. And we published a book by her recently called The Royal Heretic. And that is one of the best sword and sorcery epic fantasy stories I've ever read. I was blown away by it when I read it, because I was like, this is her first book, and she just nails everything. She's created such a foundation, and I'm glad this is going to be a series. It was a kind of book that I read, and when I ended it, I was like, okay, where's the second part? I gotta see I gotta see where this story is gonna go. Another author that I published recently is a brother by the name of Enoch Zambaya. And Enoch's actually from Zambia. He got in contact with me. He said he read Griot Sisters of the Spear. He was inspired by it, and he sent me some a story that eventually became a novel. I like him because he has a very epic fantasy feel to his work. And he's working from an indigenous African culture. So that brings a perspective to the storytelling. That's something that Charles and I talked about, because initially most Sword and Soul was coming from African-American authors and doing the research. And we always talked about, I wonder how this storytelling is going to be when we start getting authors from African cultures. And Enoch is one of those. And there's a lot of them out there now, and they're telling some great stories, and it's actually came out like we did. And I know I should have talked about one person, but there's also B. Sharice Moore, whose book I just published, Dr. Marvelous Gens Art Scholars, which is which goes into my steampunk, diesel funk genres. And again, another great storyteller. I read a book by her years ago, and she does a really good job at incorporating history and fiction and just putting it all together to make a great book. It actually was we released it this year, and it was our best performing release ever.
Oh, awesome.
It did great. I was kind of envious, because he actually sold more books than I've sold on my own first time.
Another publisher-writer problem.
Yeah, Exactly.
Like, I'm happy as a publisher, as a writer. I don't know. Yeah.
Why are they not selling me? It's my but it's a good problem to have.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's awesome, man. Well, okay, so I've really enjoyed chatting with you, and I've got like 30 more questions. Maybe we should do this again sometime. But for now, I'm going to link, of course, to your website, your business website, and every social media I've been able to find, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But, let's get into final question. What are you and MV Media working on now? Like, what's the newest stuff people can check out or in the near future, and where can people find you?
Okay, we've got a number of books coming out, actually been released this year. They're basically paperback versions of books that we had in ebook fashion, like Fallen, which is Shange and Majoga, which is actually a Sword and Soul series based in the Changa universe. It's out right now. We have another one coming out called The Long Walk, which is a steampunk story based on a rite of passage world that Balogun and I developed together, and it's a really interesting story. I think people would enjoy it. I'm actually one of the things that I like is that I get to work with authors that I admire, And so this year we actually have we're re-releasing a book by author Minister Faust called The Alchemist of Kush. I actually read the book years ago and loved it. And I met Minister Faust a few years ago when he came to Atlanta to speak at Georgia Tech. And so we, developed a relationship, and I was like, hey man, I really would like to publish a book by you. He said, hey, great. He said, how about The Alchemist of Kush? I'm like, oh man, I get to publish my favorite book by you.
Nice.
So it's a great book. Minister Faust is a great storyteller. I published some of his short stories in some of my anthologies. So those are probably the main books we're working on right now. I've got a serial novel that's going to be on my Patreon called Black Rose, which is actually my first historical fiction novel. Again, I go to the Swahili culture, but this is a book about a Swahili merchant who ends up taking in a Japanese princess on the request of her father because their family is in a dire situation. And so I talk about this relationship between them and how, she ends up actually eventually taking this young girl to East Africa and raising her within the Swahili culture. So I'm really excited about that one. So that'll be coming out as well.
Yeah, that'll be on your Patreon. Is that like patreon.com/?
Yeah, it's going to be an MV Media Patreon. I'm going to launch it next month. And I'm going to have certain stories that are going to be specific to the Patreon that after they become full-fledged novels, then I'll release them and stuff like that. But to read them as we're developing them, if you're a Patreon member, you can follow them as we're developing.
Very cool. And also you further utilizing the fact that you're both writer and publisher. I was just in my last interview talking with someone about how, you see some authors releasing like early drafts of their chapters on their Patreon, but then they try and get it published and they kind of run into trouble because like publishers may be like, yeah, you already kind of put this out.
Since I'm the publisher.
Exactly. No problem.
There's no problem with that. We also have a couple of animation projects. We're working on one called Playing the Odds, which is a cyberpunk series that we're working on right now. I've got a great team working together on that. And we've got the From Here to Timbuktu animation that I'm working with Avaloy Studios in Atlanta. We've got a pilot out. We're actually working on getting that done as well. We'll probably be announcing crowdfunders for both of those projects in the near future to get them going. So a lot of stuff going on.
Very cool, man. All right. Awesome. Well, like I say, I could just chat with you all day, man. Anytime you're up in Toronto, I'll buy you a beer. But right here, right now, I guess I should tie it off. So again, thank you so much for being here, Milton.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. Enjoy it.
All right, man. Take care.
You too.
So, I'm Writing a Novel features original music by Gloria Guns and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to submit a question, then please email it to soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Bonus points if you record yourself and send me an MP3 I can cut into the show. Doesn't have to be fancy. Using your phone is fine. Just keep it clear and concise. You can also holler at the show on Twitter. Look for @so_writing, @so_writing. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, leaving a review on iTunes, and checking out patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. Patrons get to be thanked in the final novel, listen to episodes of the podcast a week early, and even enjoy a bonus podcast called So I Wrote a Novel, where I read and comment on chapters of previous works, starting with my first novel, Junkyard Leopard. Thanks for hanging out with me and Milton, and I'll see you soon.